The talks in Istanbul have been called a failure by CNN. But now new reports say Russia is building up troops near the front line. US officials believe the Kremlin might be preparing for a new offensive with the goal of capturing more territory, possibly even advancing toward the outskirts of Kyiv again. We're joined by Frederick Kagan, Senior Fellow and Director of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute. Together with the Institute of Study of War, he tracks every turn of Russia's war in Ukraine and recently co-authored a landmark report on how Ukraine is rewriting the rules of maneuver warfare. Dr. Kagan, it's a pleasure to have you here in the studio of Channel 24.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
You know, I was thinking, I have a list of questions to you, but you know, I cannot ignore what's happening in Istanbul right now. And you've probably heard that Russia is, you know, all the bold statements they have, that they are threatening Ukraine, and they are saying that they will fight whenever it takes, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or even more than 20. Well, from your perspective, all these statements, are they, you know, serious? Should we take them seriously? Is there bluffing? Is there a psychological game or just a real threat of a new Russian offensive?
Well, the answer to all of those questions is yes, because it's Russia. And so there's always a psychological game, and there's always an effort at bluffing. They certainly mean what they say in that they intend to fight for as long as it takes. They do intend to continue to conduct offensive operations. They do intend to pursue their full objectives, which include driving Ukraine to capitulation. And I don't think that those objectives are going to change until the correlation of forces changes very fundamentally. But beyond that, they are also trying to create the impression that they are willing and able to do this forever, to continue to conduct these kinds of operations in order to persuade either Ukraine to give up, which I think will not happen, or to break European support from Ukraine, which I also think is unlikely, or to persuade the United States not to continue supporting Ukraine, which is more possible, but very far from certain at this point. So I think it's a combination of a true willingness to continue fighting indefinitely, although it's less clear to us that they can, with an effort to create psychological effects.
You know, but when they are talking that they can fight with us more than 20 years, but it costs a lot. It costs a lot of resources, money to pay to all those soldiers. I mean, are they capable? No, probably they are, but...
Well, yes and no. They are going to run into real limitations in their abilities to sustain these kinds of operations indefinitely. And the fantastic team at ISW has been reporting on that, including in a great report by Christina Harward on Russia's vulnerabilities. They are running out of tanks. They are not going to be able to produce enough tanks to offset their losses. They are having challenges producing other kinds of military equipment. And those challenges are going to continue. Obviously, they have a lot of people, and they have more people than Ukraine does. But there are a couple of factors that are constraining their ability actually to bring that numerical advantage to bear. One is that they have to man their military industry as well as their army, and they're taking staggering losses on the front line, which is exacerbating difficulties that they're having doing both of those things. So they're having a labor shortage in Russia, which is impacting their ability to mobilize, and that in turn means that they will have problems maintaining manpower necessary for this kind of warfare indefinitely, particularly if Putin remains unwilling to order full-scale involuntary mobilization, which is something that he's shown himself very reluctant to do since the last time that he did that in 2022. He got something like 330,000 more soldiers into his army, and something like 700,000 Russians fled the country. From what we can tell, Russian enthusiasm for involuntarily fighting in this war is not higher now than it was then. So I think that Putin will continue to be reluctant to do that, and that will be a real check on his ability to continue doing this indefinitely.
But if to look on the current situation on the front line, I mean, is it more favorable to Ukraine or to Russia, or it's hard to say?
Well, the Russians have been conducting offensive operations uninterruptedly since basically January of 2024. And the Ukrainians have managed basically to stop them from taking almost any settlement of significance outside of Avdiivka, which they took at the start of that series of offensives. In 2024, the Russians lost close to 500,000 soldiers for an area that in the US we say is about 9/10 the size of the state of Rhode Island, which is one of our smallest states. It's a bit larger than Luxembourg. That's a huge success for Ukraine. It doesn't feel like a success because it's Ukrainian forces on the defensive, and they've been slowly losing ground, and losing ground is losing ground. And I don't want to present this as a wonderful thing because it isn't. But it is a success in that the Russians have thrown everything that they've had at an effort to take the city of Pokrovsk, to take all of Donetsk Oblast, to take Chasiv Yar, to take Konstantinivka, and they haven't taken any of those. And they've had to settle for grinding fights that net them fields and small villages. And again, every hectare that's lost to Ukraine is a tragedy, and every village that's lost is a tragedy. But when you look at the scale of losses that Ukrainians have inflicted on the Russians for the very limited gains the Russians have made, and when you look at the fact that Ukrainian forces have prevented the Russians from achieving any of their major military objectives over the past year and a half, it's quite an accomplishment for Ukraine. And it is part of what Ukraine will need to do in order to get Putin to understand that he's not going to be able to conquer Ukraine militarily, and he's going to have to change the way that he thinks about this war.
Well, I hope for that. But, many experts say this war has become not just a drone war, but a logistic war. When supplies change, repair lines and ammunition stocks matter more than slogans. Do you agree that logistics are now the key to victory? Or is that something serious right now?
Well, logistics are always part of the key to victory. This is always an essential component of war. It's an often overlooked component of war. People get fixated on flashy technology and on battlefield advances. But if you don't have a solid supply chain, if you don't have a solid logistics system, then you won't be able to fight. Ukraine has done an amazing job of creating a complex and resilient supply chain, and of increasingly limiting its dependence on single sources of supply, and particularly the United States. When we looked at the situation when the U.S. aid was suspended from 2023 into 2024, and we looked at how devastating the effects of that suspension were on Ukraine's ability to fight, and we compare that to the situation now, we see that Ukraine and its particularly European and to some extent its Asian friends and partners have really managed to diversify their sources of supply in a way that has made them a lot less dependent on the United States as a sole essential provider. And I think the other dynamic that we're seeing, which is very positive, is that the Europeans are increasingly realizing that they have a lot of skin in this game, and they are going to have to continue to step up and help Ukraine as a way of helping themselves. And I think that that's a very promising start, and I hope that over the course of this summer and through this year, we will see that impulse solidified into a real long-term commitment backed by meaningful investments in European preparations to help Ukraine sustain its supply chain and its logistics.
But are we good in destroying Russian supply chains? I mean, somehow to, interrupt all that?
It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to disrupt the supply chains of a large state, and Russia is a huge state. Ukrainian forces have been extremely good at finding very creative ways to take advantage of Russian mistakes, sometimes blowing up massive Russian ammunition depots, and at other times driving Russian forces away from airfields that they need, and so on. I think that given the capabilities that Ukraine actually has and is likely to be able to have, Ukraine is doing as good a job as it can. But at the end of the day, it's really for the international community to continue to bring pressure and ideally increase the pressure on the other countries like Iran and North Korea and China that are helping Russia and giving Russia access to their military industries. And in some cases, in the case of the Iranians and the North Koreans in particular, of course, actually just giving the Russians lots of weapons to get that to stop. That's not something Ukraine can do. And it will be very hard for the world to do, but I think the world could be doing more.
Yes. Andrius Kubilius, the first ever European Commissioner for Defense and Space, he was recently in Kyiv on defense conference, security conference, and he told to Ukrainian journalists that there is less and less weaponry in the world that Ukraine would not be able to produce on its own, even air defense system. What is your take on that?
Ukraine has done an amazing job. I mean, let's start by remembering, I don't need to remind you, and I don't need to remind my Ukrainian friends, but the world needs to remember that Ukraine had a major defense industry before the full-scale invasion. It had a basis on which to build. It was a significant arms exporter. And of course, Kyiv was the heart of the Soviet aerospace industry. And Ukraine has done an amazing job of developing defense industry, military industry during the war, and developing the ability to produce a lot of the weapons that it had been receiving from the West. I think it's going to be very important for Ukraine and for Europe to continue to work on co-investment, European investment in Ukrainian defense industry. And that's probably going to require some challenging changes for Ukraine as well to ensure that Europeans benefit from that, especially over the long term as well. I think Ukraine ultimately can become one of the arsenals of freedom, working with European investors and European defense industry in this way. That said, I think there are some systems that Ukraine will have a very hard time replicating anytime soon. Systems like the Patriot that are able to intercept ballistic missiles are extremely difficult to develop. I would love to see an indigenous Ukrainian version of that, but
difficult. Difficult. But is that possible? Even let's imagine in 5 or 10 years.
I can't give a timeline on it. The fact that we developed it means that it can be developed, and so I think with sufficient investment, and particularly in conjunction with European and Asian partners, I'm certain that it can be replicated, but I have no idea in what time or at what cost.
Yeah. I often hear that Russia isn't just avoiding a ceasefire because it still plans to conquer Ukraine, but also because its economy has been restructured for war. Would stopping the war now hit Russia's war economy too hard? Does this mean the war could drag on indefinitely? So, I mean, when Kremlin's saying that they just want to, capture Ukraine and to achieve all their goals, is that really true? Or is that, something economical background behind that?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's really true. I think Putin will not be satisfied, and a Putinist regime in Russia will not be satisfied until it has conquered Ukraine or forced Ukraine's capitulation in some way. And I don't think Ukraine will capitulate. So I think Russians will have to continue to try to find ways to conquer it, at which I'm certain they will fail, by the way.
Thank you.
But I think that's real. Certainly, Putin would have problems rapidly off-ramping the military industry, and even more dealing with the demobilization of the military forces he has now. I don't think that's driving the war, because I don't think he intends to demobilize even when he's done with Ukraine. He's made it clear that he has objectives that transcend Ukraine, objectives in Europe, objectives against NATO, objectives against former Soviet states. And so I think that Putin is actually preparing for a long-term permanent mobilization in a way, as he's creating an ideology in Russia that is sort of like this. It's sort of like the Soviet ideology minus communism. And that's an ideology in which Russia decides that it's threatened by the entire world and has to be on a permanent war footing in response to that threat, I think that's an ideology that Lieutenant Colonel Putin found very comfortable as a KGB officer, and I think that that's the ideology that he's bringing back. So I think he can manage to have the fighting stop in Ukraine and retain mobilization on the basis of the ideology that he's creating. But I don't think that he's going to stop fighting in Ukraine until one of two things happens. Either until he defeats Ukraine, which again I'm confident that he won't be able to do, or until he's forced to realize that he is not able to achieve his objectives in Ukraine by force, and that trying to do so will just make the situation worse for him. And I think the task that faces Ukraine and the United States and Europe in trying to bring this war to a rapid and just end is the task of persuading Putin of exactly that, that further military activity will only generate worse effects and worse results for Russia.
Yeah. Let's go back to what happened on the 9th of May, the Victory Day parade in Moscow. Can we say that Russia's military capabilities have actually improved? You said previously that it's not, but they were picturing through propaganda all these statements and messages giving to the world. What is your perspective watching the parade was?
From the perspective of somebody who's been watching the war in Ukraine, it was not particularly interesting because we saw them highlight the stuff that they're using in Ukraine, and we know that they're using those capabilities, and we know that the Ukrainians have been able to stop them even with those capabilities, and I'm confident that that will continue to be true. From my perspective as an American military analyst who's interested in the defense of Europe and the defense of the United States, what was interesting to me was the degree to which Putin was highlighting things like small drones and longer range drones and other systems like that in the military parade, which is usually used to showcase what will be the future power of Russia. And that tells me that Putin doesn't intend to go back to some old armored forces, heavy kind of fighting. He does recognize that he is engaged in the future of warfare in Ukraine right now. And that's where he intends to go. So that's very important for us as Western analysts. In terms of showing me the quality of the Russian military, the Victory Day parades are qualities of Russian military spectacle. We see the quality of the Russian military every day on the battlefield in Ukraine, and what I know about that quality is it's not sufficient to overcome Ukraine's armed forces.
And how do you interpret the recent visit of the Chinese leader to Moscow? He was visiting on the 8th, on 9th of May. Was that some signal to the world? What do you think?
Well, unfortunately, the Sino-Russian relationship is deepening, and we are seeing the Chinese providing important support to the Russian war effort. And Xi Jinping is, if anything, increasing his commitment to Putin. We do need to recognize that the Russians and Chinese and the Iranians and the North Koreans form a sort of a grouping that is collectively determined to destroy the leadership of the free peoples of the world, and is fundamentally antithetical to freedom. And is willing to work together to a considerable extent to that end. Beyond that, I think it's important not to focus excessively on the spectacles and the symbolism. We see what's going on the battlefield every day. We see the Chinese components that are turning up in Russian equipment. We know how dependent the Russians are on Chinese, ostensibly dual-use support. This is a problem, and this is something the world needs to take very seriously.
And what kind of world do you see if Russia will dominate, if Russia will win? What would the global order look like?
It would be devastating for the world and for the global order. It would be devastating for freedom. It would be devastating for Europe, and it would be devastating for the United States of America for Russia to prevail in Ukraine. I think it's very hard to argue the contrary. As I said earlier, the Russians have ambitions that transcend Ukraine, and putting the resources of Ukraine at the disposal of those ambitions would create an incredibly dangerous and difficult situation for Europe and for the United States with its interests in Europe and with its commitments to the defense of Europe. And of course, if Russia were to succeed in his ambitions in Ukraine, it would encourage Xi Jinping to pursue his ambitions over Taiwan and elsewhere in Asia even more aggressively. And it would persuade him that the West and the United States in particular were simply not willing to stand up for their interests, even when they were not being called upon to fight. So it would be devastating. This is why I'm confident that it's in the interests of Europe, it's in the interest of our Asian allies and partners, and it's in the interest of the United States to help Ukraine prevent that from happening. And I'm very confident that if we continue to help Ukraine, that will not happen.
At the beginning of full-scale invasion, Dr. Kagan, I was reading some of your articles and listening to the interview, and you were explaining why helping Ukraine is strategic interest of the United States. But what does America actually gain from this commitment right now?
Well, at the moment, America isn't being asked to do anything other than sell weapons for Ukraine to be given to Ukraine. So it's important to recognize that no one at this point is asking the United States to give a lot more aid money without any sort of recompense to Ukraine. And so there's a lot of benefit at this point. The benefits are, on the one hand, avoiding the very bad world situation that I described when you asked me to contemplate the scenario of a Russian victory.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to overestimate how important that is. My colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Elaine McCusker, produced a terrific report highlighting the literal costs to the United States that would be entailed in defending, in being prepared to defend Europe against Russia that had conquered Ukraine. And the costs are astronomical, and they're far higher than American assistance to Ukraine has been thus far, or that it would be. So there's a direct financial incentive there, but of course there's also the incentive of avoiding a future war. Because as long as the Russians are stopped in Ukraine, the likelihood that they will be able and willing to conduct a large-scale assault on NATO in the near future is lower. If the Russians actually dominate in Ukraine, they will be in a position to pose an enormous military threat to Europe much more rapidly. And that's an unnecessary threat. It's an avoidable problem. And the solution is simply in helping Ukraine fight, which is what Ukrainians want to do.
Dr. Kagan, what do you think about the coalition of the willing? I was talking with Tom Cooper. He's super pessimistic. I was talking with Mr. Landsbergis. He's also not very optimistic. What is your perception?
I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I think that it's a good development. I think that we all need to do everything in our power to encourage it along. At the end of the day, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. We're not going to talk about NATO membership here. This is obviously not on the table right now. What matters here is whether there are European states that are willing to step in and help. Particularly right now, the question is secure Ukraine in the case of an acceptable ceasefire. The coalition of the willing is saying that it's willing to do that, is talking about exactly how it would go about doing that in ways that I think are sensible. I think, again, the art here is not being optimistic or pessimistic, but doing everything that we can to help those states with the will and the capability to do so, to coalesce into a solid grouping that is prepared to help defend the peace and when an acceptable peace can be brought about. And that's the purpose of the coalition of the willing, and I think that it's a good step forward.
As long as you're mentioning NATO, is there a chance that a new military alliance could actually be formed, either as an alternative to NATO or in cooperation with it?
I think that Ukraine can form bilateral and multilateral security agreements with the key states in Europe, if they are willing to do so, that will be at least as effective as a NATO guarantee, because at the end of the day, what the NATO guarantee brings, apart from U.S. support, is it brings the commitment of the most powerful militaries in Europe. If Ukraine can secure that commitment in ways that don't involve NATO, look, there are disadvantages to NATO. NATO makes decisions about going to war, including about respecting Article 5 requests by consensus in the North Atlantic Council. That that was not. No one expected that to be a major problem when the question was answering a massive Soviet threat across the inter-German border. But it may be more of an issue in the future for reasons that I don't have to elaborate on. Ukraine can and should pursue bilateral security agreements and multilateral security agreements that don't have such problems and that do simply bind the other states to come to Ukraine's defense in the event of an attack. I think that can be a suitable, not necessarily substitute, but support and addition for possible NATO membership down the road.
Yeah, I meant like something additional, but I just,
Yeah.
We're observing, watching with whom it may be happen, like France, Great Britain, Poland, probably three of them may be possible.
Yes, I think if France and Great Britain are essential for many, many reasons, not least because they are nuclear powers, and so they have a deterrent capability against Russian nuclear threats, which makes more credible the idea that they would come to Ukraine's military support. So I think that having one or ideally both of them as part of any such coalition is essential. Happily, they are both part of this emerging coalition of the willing. And I think that over time, the Germans can also be a part of this, and a very important part. The Germans have massive industrial potential, which at the moment is what's most urgently required. And Poland, the Polish clearly recognize the threat to them, and clearly, apart from the tensions that, of course, re-emerge periodically, and that the Russians do everything in their power to fan constantly, the Poles do understand how tightly their fate is bound up with Ukraine. And I think other Eastern European states, some of them do as well. So I think there's a good basis here. And again, we all need to work to make that basis a solid foundation and build on it.
Yes, and how can Ukraine's modernized army help bring stability to Europe?
Well, a Ukraine that has actually defended itself and established a defensible border and an acceptable peace will be the bulwark of Europe. It will be an enormous challenge for the Russians to contemplate military operations against northeastern Europe if there is a strong Ukraine in their rear of those forces. And I think Ukraine has every promise of becoming an arsenal of freedom and a major source of the modern techniques of war, where it already is, the modern software of war, which it already is, and the modern technology and the modern industrial production of war. I think Ukraine will be a tremendous asset. A free Ukraine will be a tremendous asset to Europe and to the United States and to all of the free peoples of the world.
That's a nice quote. I'm just writing down. Okay, and while I'm listening all these conferences happening around the world, press conferences, meetings, Davos, everybody's saying about the red lines. When Russia will cross the red line, then we will impose more sanctions. We will help Ukraine as never. But you know what? I don't know, actually, Dr. Kagan, after 3 years of full-scale invasion, what the red line means. I mean, sometimes it feels like they're just talking, but what Russia have to do that everybody will start to act as they promised to act?
I don't know. I don't like talking about red lines. I don't like issuing red lines, and I don't like overreacting. Frankly, as the Biden administration often did when other sides talk about red lines.
Yeah.
What matters really is the trajectory that we're on. And the trajectory that we're on is a trajectory toward an increased recognition by European states that have the capacity to help, that they need to help, and the recognition by those states that they're under greater threat from Russia and that they have to look to their own defenses in a way that requires supporting Ukraine. That's a trajectory that we're on. It's increasing. I'm less interested, frankly, in sudden changes than I am in solidifying that trajectory as rapidly as possible, which will take some time. But I think that that's the trajectory that we're on right now. And I think the art of this is focusing on staying on that track and building on that track and not looking for some magical switch that will flip, that will make things easy. Unfortunately, this isn't going to be easy. We're dealing with, in Putin, a determined predator who is determined to predate upon Ukraine. And it's going to take a lot to stop him. And it's not something that's going to happen suddenly. So I think we would do better not to focus on red lines and looking for, rapid solutions. And I understand how painful it is for me to be speaking to a Ukrainian audience and saying this. I know that you are fighting the war. I know, of course, you want this war to end as soon as possible. I do. We all do, but no one wants that more than Ukrainians. But this is the difficult situation that we're in, facing an adversary like Putin. And so I think we need to focus on cementing this trajectory into a long-term effort. That's what will actually be needed.
Yeah. Dr. Kagan, I really thank you for your insights and this deep interview and, giving us hope and, how you see all the situation and looking very deeply. And I hope that I will see you again in our studio.
I would love to do that. Thank you for the opportunity.